Hey students, welcome back to Strategy of Missions and Leadership Development. We are now in section 2 of our course, and last time we looked at the history of missions and the strategies involved there and looking at the early church. And now today we are going to be looking at the strategies of missions in the Middle Ages, and we're going to be breaking this into 2 sections. So this video will be part 1. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, now we're going to move into this portion of the PowerPoint on strategies of missions and leadership development. And we're continuing our look at the history of the strategy of missions. And in this PowerPoint, we'll be looking at the medieval mission strategy, part 1, because this is broken into 2 parts. The first part we're going to be looking at here, as you see in the introductory material, the year 500 AD until 1215 AD. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the church and the missionary movement that takes place. So as the church and the missionaries moved into the 6th century, it developed in a different world than previous centuries. So the Roman Empire had been persecuting the Christians before Constantine, and then when Constantine became the emperor and the empire turned into a Christian empire, the church was able to grow fairly quickly all across the empire. We looked at that last time. So it's a different world. And as we move into 500 AD and so on, we see that the church is going to go through some different changes based on the culture or the society that the Christians find themselves in. So the church's great supporter, which was the Christian Roman Empire, key protector of the church, and now that the empire was Christian, it was a great supporter of the churches. Well, the Roman Empire crumbled. It fell in 476 AD, and so now the great supporter of the church is pretty much gone in regards to an empire. And now the church steps into the vacuum and basically becomes very powerful and influential. Now there's going to be different areas of the shattered Roman Empire that are going to be controlled by different kings and different areas, and so that control different areas. And so the church becomes almost like this overarching umbrella over all of these nations that we see in what we would say Europe or Christendom. And so just to continue on with our look at the introductory material, basically this slide is a repeat of the previous one, except this very last bullet point. The church developed in the East and the West, and they kind of had a different identity, and that's going to actually lead to an East-West split. So as the church is this overarching umbrella over all of these nations, the church itself is also going to have an issue, and they're going to end up splitting later on in the Middle Ages. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the Nestorian church. The Nestorian church was very active in spreading the gospel to the East. And the Nestorian church was basically followers of Nestorius. So you see his dates, 356 to 481. And by the time the Nestorian church moves into the East, Nestorius is dead. We've now moved into past 500 AD. And the thing is that Nestorius, he was an exiled bishop of Alexandria. Again, that was a very big area for Christianity. And he established the Nestorian church, and is called that because they were followers of his theology. And he didn't have the best theology. There were some definitely some things that he believed that we would not believe as Orthodox Christians. And his belief kind of revolved around Mary, and if she was the bearer of God or if she was the bearer of Christ, which basically means you can look at Jesus as not as divine as God. And so there was some things off about his theology, but they were very evangelistic. As you see there, they were very fiercely evangelistic, and they spread to the East. They had a major impact in Syria, and they established Nestorian churches in Syria. Then these Syrian Nestorians spread into India. So in India, they actually linked up with the Toma churches because there was already an established Christian church there in India. Most believe that church there was started by the Apostle Thomas in the 1st century, because tradition holds that the Apostle Thomas went to India and proclaimed the gospel there and started churches in India. So the Nestorian church was a great force for evangelism to spread to the East. But one thing that we're going to be looking at here is we're going to be looking at the Christianization of Europe, which we'll be looking at the western part of Europe. From 500 to 1215, we're going to be looking at Great Britain. There were Christian churches established early on in Great Britain because of the spread of Roman Christians. Remember what I said about the Roman roads went all the way up into Britain, and you saw that map in the previous lecture. Well, there was Christianity in Britain. And then as the Roman Empire retreated, the void allowed for the barbarians called the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes to invade the territory or the island of Britain and destroy churches and kill Christians there. These were barbarian groups that were out for basically looting and taking what they could, but they definitely destroyed churches and killed Christians. Well, the Irish monks, who we call Celtic Christians, Irish monks saw the need to cross over to Britain and evangelize the people there. The key here is, as you see on the bottom of the screen, so it's the key, the capital T-H-E, the key to this was the missionary center of Iona. Okay, that's an actual location that the monks established, and it's still there today, not as a missionary center, but you can go there and see ruins of an old convent, and you can see the rebuilt monastery that they started, the missionary center of Iona. So here's a map of the Angles and the Jutes and the Saxons moving across. So after the Romans, see, here's my arrow. This is where like the Hadrian's Wall would be, moving back and forth. As the Romans retreated, as the empire began to crumble, the Romans actually left England and moved back on the continent of Europe and moved back towards Rome. And that left the opportunity for these barbarians to sweep in from these outside areas. So you can see these arrows coming in. And they came in and they attacked churches, Christians. They basically ravaged the land to take what they wanted. Okay, so now let's look at the missionary center of Iona. So it was founded in 563 AD by the Irish monk Columba, who was in Ireland, and he was doing his thing as a monk, and he had to flee Ireland. There's a couple different reasons why people think he had to flee, but he had to flee Ireland, and what he did was he and a group of monks crossed the sea in a wicker boat that was covered with animal hides or with leather. And they crossed the sea, and they landed on the island of Iona, which is actually off the coast, off just a little bit. There's a little tiny waterway that separates it from mainland Scotland. And so they land there on this island, and they established a monastery there. And what he did was he set up this monastery as an evangelistic training center and a launching point to send monastic missionaries to Great Britain to evangelize the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. There was also the Picts were there, and so they were able to go onto mainland Britain and evangelize. So here's a couple of pictures. You can see here on the left, Northern Ireland over here in Ireland, and what they did, and so you see this line here for Scotland, what they did was they got in a boat and they landed up here on this little tiny island of Iona. And so over here on the right, you can see the rebuilt monastery. So this is rebuilt. Obviously, you can see how nice and neat and nice condition it is. And then down here is actually the ruins of a convent that was built later on as a nunnery for Catholic nuns on this island. And they set this up as a training center and a launch point to launch over to Scotland. So this here is the island of Mull, where my arrow is circling here next to the star. So they would go over there, and then they moved over to Scotland, and they spread out, setting up monasteries. And so that was part of his strategy, which we're going to look at here coming up next. So St. Columba's Ionian strategy, and again, this was very effective. And there's actually been studies on this Celtic way of evangelism and some books written about it because it was so effective. It's basically people started looking at, is this the way that we should do missions because it was so effective. So number one, Columba sent missionaries out of Iona. As I said, they set up that monastery as a training center, but also a launching point out into Scotland and then into England. So what they did was they left to evangelize the pagan Picts, which are in northern Scotland. It was the first people group that they would run into as they come across over to the island of Britain, which in the north is Scotland. And so their idea was to start churches and monasteries with a strong link and a model after the mother monastery back in Iona. So you can see that the mother monastery would start like a daughter monastery, and then the daughter monastery would then launch out and create another daughter monastery. And so you can see this kind of network of monasteries scattering around. So that was the first idea, was to send out missionaries. Then number two, Columbus solidified Iona's ecclesiastical influence over civil matters. So what he did was, being a man that was looked at as a holy man, this humble abbot Columba, who was basically there to serve and minister, he ended up crowning the king of Dalriada at the Ionian monastery in 574. So now you see this Christian leader, monk, he's basically in charge of this monastery, crowning a king. And so it kind of gives this stamp of approval of Christianity on this king. And so it kind of just made a legitimization of the Christian message, because this humble abbot goes and crowns a king. Number three, after the conversion of King Brudet, who was the king of the Picts in the north, the door was open to evangelize the Picts. So again, that was kind of the strategy of St. Patrick that was in Ireland. Well, Columba, being an Irish monk, he brought that idea over, and so he evangelized King Brudet and ended up opening the door to evangelize the Picts, who the Picts were a very violent and warlike people. Number four, Iona became a missional center of activity. So just continuing that thought, we see a couple of bullet points under that number four. Numerous missionaries were sent out of Iona. I had already mentioned that. It attracted many Celt believers to come to the island of Iona for training in Christianity, in theology, in evangelism. And so then they would go back to their hometowns and proclaim Christ there. The ascetic life, prayer, teaching, study, transcription of the scripture, illumination of the scripture, which is kind of like copying with artistic lettering and artistic drawings in the lettering itself. It's called illumination. These became like staples of the missionary center to bring kind of a focused life for Christianity. And so that's what happened at the missionary center. Many people were searching for answers, and so what would just naturally happen was the sick would arrive, and they would come to Iona, and those that were in need would come to Iona and would be ministered to there, and we would help the people there. And this kind of idea occurred in all the monasteries that were set up across Scotland and across England to reach and help the sick or the needy and share Christ with them. And it became so influential in the island of Iona that Ireland, from which Columba was from, sought the monastic leaders on Iona, because they were doing such an effective job for missions, to come back to Ireland and to set up kind of the same strategy and lead monasteries back there to do the same thing and be launching centers for the spread of Christianity. And then number five, Iona missionary activity spread out past the Scots and the Picts and covered pretty much all of England and even further on. Another monastery, Lindisfarne, was modeled after Iona on the opposite side of England. So now you had two main missionary centers. You had Iona and you have Lindisfarne, and both of them are launching out monasteries, which in turn are launching out monasteries. And if they didn't launch out a monastery, they would pretty much at minimum launch out and start a church within certain areas of these people groups. It didn't have to be just straight up monastery, but they could also start churches. And so you see in this map now how it happened. So the big arrow is when Columba came from Ireland and set up Iona, and then from Iona they launched out into all parts of Scotland, and then here's Lindisfarne over here on the right-hand side of England, and then they dropped down into England and continued on, and it went well past this map. as we're going to see. But you see how effective it was, this network of mother monasteries to daughter monasteries and so on, and these training centers that reach the people for Christ. Okay, now we're going to just continue on our movement from England and now look at continental Europe. Well, Iona's influence spread across the English Channel and landed in Europe. Iona's missionaries would cross and they spread all around France and all the way down to Switzerland. And so you have Celts, you have Irish missionaries by way of England moving all the way down to Central Europe, which is Switzerland. So there was other monasteries set up along that same mindset, with the daughter monastery birthing another monastery and reaching the people that way. So Iona had an influence on continental Europe, but also there was this missional activity on continental Europe that involved power encounters. And what we mean by power encounters is that a missionary would do something great and would be seen as a religious person with a lot of power. And that could be anything from, they may have been attributed to performing miracles or confronting a false god and they were not struck down by lightning or something to that effect. No bad thing happened to them, so they're more powerful than a false god. And so the people began to see these missionaries and looking at them in a different light, that they truly had the hand of God on them. So there were many Christians already in Central Europe, obviously because of the Roman Empire. However, they were ravaged by the barbarians that had come in. So the church had struggled there because of the barbarians that had come in. And also the barbarians, they needed evangelizing also. So there was definitely the opportunity for the church to go and spread the gospel. We see a few of these missionaries. We have Willebrord, who is the Low Countries. So that's going to be like where Belgium is, and the Netherlands, Denmark area. So we see Willebrord in the Low Countries. But we also see Boniface. Boniface here, he was a missionary in the Germanic area, so kind of like where Germany is now. Now, Germany was not a country or a nation at that time. It was part of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. But these are basically just Germanic areas, kind of like city-states or Germanic states that were run by a king. Each one was run by a king. So you see there on the slide, Boniface, he ministered there for 40 years in this area, and he was credited with chopping down Thor's sacred oak in Hesse, which is part of Germany today. And this was one of those power encounters. Because he was not killed by Thor for cutting down the sacred oak, he was viewed as greater than Thor, and he had a very powerful influence on the pagans as a man of the true God. So Boniface was a missionary there in continental Europe. Okay, so let's look at another area of Europe. It's still considered part of Europe, is Scandinavia. The major threat and opportunity for Christians was the Vikings. And so we hear all kinds of stories of the Vikings, and there were definitely movies recently made. History Channel did a series on the Vikings. But these were a barbarian group that was extremely vicious. They were out to plunder and pillage and take what they could from whoever they could get it from. And so they were very savage. And they were a serious threat. And they began to attack Britain in the 9th century, so around 800s AD. And what they did was they would attack the British churches, because in Britain you had churches, and that's where there would be things like gold chalices and gold platters and different things that the priests would use for the Mass and for the different things they would do in church, and they were made of precious metals. There might have been jewels involved or set in these things, and expensive tapestries or expensive clothing or whatever it may be. But that's where the wealth was, and so they would attack these churches, steal what they could, and destroy the churches. Well, there were some brave missionaries that went and evangelized Denmark, Norway, Sweden. These are Scandinavian areas. Even though Denmark is on the continent, it was still looked at as Scandinavian, where Vikings were from. But this one missionary is named Ansgar from 801 to 865 AD. He was a French monk missionary who trained in a monastery that was founded by Columba. So this is one of Columba's monastic students. May not have been trained right from Columba, but definitely one of the teachers in the monastery trained Ansgar. And Ansgar set up a monastery center in Corbie, France, to send out missionary monks, and this was modeled after Iona. So Ansgar set this up to launch missionaries out from that monastery in Corbie, France. And so we see just an artistic impression of Vikings attacking a Christian church. You see the church in the background basically being burned, and you see the Viking about to chop this old priest he's holding a staff with the cross on it. Here's a villager trying to protect him. But you just see an artistic impression. Oh, and then back here you see the Vikings putting the loot on top of the backs of the horses and carrying. You see these two guys carrying the loot. So they've gone in and stolen the wealth from the churches, and now they're attacking the Christians. And even in his arms here, I just almost missed that. You see some chalices and platters that would have been taken from the church, and so people are being killed now in the graveyard of the church. So in the middle is an image of Ansgar as an archbishop, and he's holding a model of the church in his hands, and this represents that he was taking the church to these pagan lands. On the right is the monastery today at Corbie. Obviously, this was later on of a building from when he was a monk there. You can definitely see that this is a medieval style building with the flying buttresses that are holding up the walls of that cathedral. So this is Corbie's monastery today, even though it looks like a church of the Middle Ages. So we see Christianization of Europe continuing on here, and we're going to look at Eastern Europe for a moment. In 1054, the Eastern Church, which was based in Constantinople, not Rome, formally split from the Roman Church, and this is called the East and West Schism of 1054. Now, the Greek and Orthodox churches grew out of this split, and the Byzantine Empire basically was the wall stopping the Islamic encroachment on the East. So we see now that the Eastern Church has solidified into its own identity. The Byzantine Empire, which is based in Greece and even into Turkey, is basically holding back Islam coming from the East, even though that's going to fail later on. Well, we see two missionaries, Cyril and Methodius. These were two missionaries that were instrumental in missional activity, and their strategy, which is fairly effective, was they translated the Bible into the people's language so that people could read it, or at least read it to somebody else that might be illiterate, but read the Bible in their own language instead of Greek and Latin. And definitely the Roman side of the church in the West focused in and rooted their Mass and their Bible in the Latin. So here in the East, the people could understand the Bible in their own language. Okay, so now let's look at Christianization of Europe and dealing with Islam in the West. After Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Islam spread like wildfire across North Africa. And we see that after the conquer of North Africa, Islamic forces crossed over to Spain and then headed into France. And the man that comes to the forefront here is Charles the Hammer Martel. And he defeated the Islamic forces at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. And what he did was he pushed the Islamic armies back to Africa, and they would stay in Africa. There were a few pockets still in Spain, but the Muslims would basically stay in Africa from then on, and this sets up Christian Europe, which we call Christendom, for centuries of conflict, which would continue on with the Muslims. So one of the things we need to talk about with the Christianization of Europe is the Crusades. And so I put there in parentheses as a mission, question mark. Were the Crusades an actual mission? The Crusades had a huge impact on Christian and Muslim relations, which last all the way up until today. There were 7 official Crusades. There were some unofficial Crusades. The First and Third Crusades are the most well known, mainly because the first one was the only successful crusade. They did free the Holy Land of the Muslims in the First Crusade, but then they lost it again and the Muslims came back. The Third Crusade is very well known because it was led by Richard the Lionheart, but that crusade failed because they did not kick the Muslims out of the Holy Land. They ended up creating a treaty with them, and they both kind of shared the Holy Land. So it really wasn't very successful. But it is well known because Richard the Lionheart fought in this crusade. Well, the main goal of the Crusades was to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims. There were other ideas out there or other reasons out there for why they did it. One of them was to help the Byzantines to try to stop the encroaching Islamic Turks from moving into what is modern-day Turkey today. And there were some other reasons, try to heal the split in the church, and the Pope could become more powerful. There's all kinds of different reasons why the Crusades took place. But the strategy here was to spread Christianity, which was basically called for by the Catholic Church, by the sword of the Christian European nations. So the Catholic Church calls for this holy war to take place, and they would then spread Christianity, but not through the gospel of peace, not through the gospel of proclaiming God's love for people and salvation in Jesus Christ. It was more spread Christianity by the tip of the sword, and the Christian European nations would send their knights and their soldiers to the Holy Land to fight and kill the Muslims that were in the Holy Land. And so here's a map with just the different crusades on it. You can see the different colors for which crusade it was and where it went to. But that's just to give you an idea of what they did. They moved from mainland Western Europe, and they moved down through the Byzantine Empire here, and then they moved into the Holy Land and fought down in here to remove the Muslims from the Holy Land with the sword under the guise of taking Christ to them. So some results of the Crusades. Well, first off, it was a complete disaster for the Christian message. And even to this day, this is definitely a black eye on Christianity. And even to this day, the Muslim will use this as a sticking point to Christians for what took place during the Crusades. Number two, it fomented hatred in the name of Christ. The Christians in Europe hated the Muslims and would definitely go down to kill them. So again, it's not anything about proclaiming the love of Christ, it's fomenting hatred. There were atrocities committed by Christians on the crusade routes. They would ravage the villages that the crusading armies would move through in Europe as they headed to the Holy Land. They would steal, they would take whatever, they would assault people, they would rape women, all kinds of stuff for these Christian knights as they moved down to the Holy Land. There was a major loss of morals among the Christian community. After a battle in which the Muslims had fled, they left their women and children behind. A crusader declared this, quote, "We did nothing evil to them, we just speared them through." So you can see that war is violent and graphic, and you can see here that they killed women and children. And it's just this kind of idea of a loss of morals. It really dulled the Christian characteristics and the fruits of the Spirit that a Christian should be showing. It really dulled those down with a loss of morals. And then number five, we see cruelty and revenge becomes commonplace. And of course, the Middle Ages and all through history, we see violence is commonplace pretty much everywhere. But when the Crusaders returned after 1215, especially when the Crusades had ended, when they returned to Europe, it was just a savage place. People would kill and with the tip of the sword and fight one another over land disputes, over all kinds of things. We start seeing executions being very graphic, where they start bringing in different devices to kill people. It's just cruelty and revenge became commonplace. And this is the results of a religious movement to take the message of Christ to the Holy Land with the tip of the sword. Okay, so that is it for Strategy of Missions and Leadership Development for this lecture. I'll see you in a second. Okay, class, that's it for looking at part one of the Middle Ages and the strategy of missions there. And next time, we're going to continue on and conclude our look at the Middle Ages with the strategy of missions in the Middle Ages, part two. I'll see you then.